Now that the beaches are finally open, I was excited to get my metal detector out again. So twice now I have packed up my metal detector and my magnet fishing magnet, and I've come down to this beach here only to discover that it is so crowded that there was really no point in trying to get the metal detector out there. Last time I came in an afternoon, it was a really hot sunny afternoon and the beach was just packed. So I thought, yeah, it's not really worthwhile trying to do this. So this morning I tried to get up early and get down here in the morning. So between my health issues and my chronic fatigue and the depression and all that stuff, it is so hard for me to get out of bed in the mornings. And the soonest I was able to get here was 11 a.m. And as you can see, it is already packed, being another hot sunny day again. So I think I'm gonna have to either make an effort to get down here very early one morning or wait till a day that isn't quite as nice and get down here on a maybe a slightly colder day. Fortunately though, I printed out all the questions people had asked me in response to my Ask Me Anything video, and I brought those with me, and I brought a book with me as well, just in case after my last experience the beach was going to be busy again, and sure enough. So what I'm going to do today is just go over the questions that everybody took the time to ask me. I really appreciate everyone who did take that time to ask me some questions and make it possible for me to create this video. So we're starting with some questions from Elias Hartmark. And the first one I included, even though you already know the answer to it, but I thought it was pretty funny because he asks, have you ever thought about making a segment for Board Game Breakfast? And the last video I uploaded talks about how I was recently accepted to be a contributor to the Board Game Breakfast show on the Dice Tower. And it was just funny timing because the day he submitted that question for me was the day I got accepted by the Dice Tower to be a contributor. So it's kind of funny that we were thinking along the same lines, and if you want to hear more about that, you can check out the video I made just talking about how I was accepted to be a contributor. Next, Elias asks, what movies do your kids like the most, and what is your favorite movie? So I'll let the kids speak for themselves. What's your very favorite movie you've ever watched?
It's hard because there's a few Pokemon ones I like. Like there's one called Mewtwo Strikes Back. Basically, it's like where Mew and Mewtwo face off, and Mewtwo creates the Ultra versions of the Pokemon to face against the real version of that Pokemon.
What is your very favorite movie that you've ever watched?
Percy Jackson or Harry Potter.
Do you have a favorite Percy Jackson or a favorite Harry Potter, or just the whole series?
Well, there's only 2 Percy Jackson movies, but I like the first one better. But for the Harry Potter movies, I like the second one.
As for my favorite movie, I so rarely watch movies anymore. I watch maybe, well, the only movies I really watch anymore are the ones I watch with my kids after I read the Harry Potter books and The Hobbit to my older boy. We watched through all those movies. Other than that, I'm really not a movie watcher. I love a good documentary, but yeah, as far as actual movies, I've long stated that my favorite movie is Snatch, just because it's so quirky and weird and fun and interesting, and outside of the normal Hollywood tropes and the boring old carbon copy plots you see over and over again in Hollywood movies. So I've really enjoyed Snatch, which was by the same people that made Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels, which was along this similar lines in terms of its stylistic presentation. And they recently released another one that I wanted to catch in theaters, but then the whole pandemic thing sort of set those plans aside. It's Guy Ritchie that directs those movies, and I think writes them as well. So I will have to catch that movie when I get a chance to find it somewhere. Elias's next question is, what is your favorite color to play in Magic the Gathering and why? So thanks, Elias, for allowing me to talk about Magic for a bit. I think it's a tough one to answer. It is easier for me to say that my least favorite color in Magic is blue. All the cards that cancel effects. Oh, I'm going to cast this spell. No, you're not. Okay, I'm going to bring this creature into play. No, you're not. Canceled. Blue annoys me, so we'll take blue off the table. Red, I am kind of neutral on. For some reason, I never really got big into red as a color. Now, In terms of color pairings, my favorite color pairing is black and white. I really enjoy what black and white can do together, and it's partly because the very first deck I ever built in Magic was a black-white Orzhov deck that was all about gaining life and taking opponent's life. And I like those sort of dual mechanisms of the white allowing life gain and the black allowing life drain of the opponent. White is probably one of my favorite support colors to add to another color to build a deck. They have a lot of fun bonus type effects and that sort of thing. And then there's something about black that really draws me. The dark, twisted, evil side of things is something that is, for some reason, has some appeal for me. But if I'm talking about monocolor decks, so a deck made up of a single color, I think it's going to be green, just because for me green represents Magic in its purest form. It represents getting a lot of mana ramp, and then using that mana to make big tramply monsters to send out onto the battlefield. And no colors do those things really better than green, in my opinion. So green, as far as a color by itself, is probably the one I tend to go to. In fact, in terms of my monocolor decks that I've built, I think I probably have more monocolor green decks than any other color. So I'm gonna have to kind of surprise myself and choose green, even though I thought I would have picked black or maybe even white. Next up, Elias asks, what is your favorite tattoo and why? And he follows that up with, are there any tattoos you regret? So in terms of favorite tattoos, my left arm in general I quite like. That's kind of a tough question, actually. I really like the stained glass style of this shoulder piece here. And I'm thinking of doing more in the stained glass style just because the visuals of it are pretty neat. I also like the representation of my gaming tattoo here on my left arm, all the fun little gaming pieces that are in there. But I think overall, if I were to pick a favorite, it would be the newest one on my left forearm here. And I don't know if it's just because it's the newest that makes it my favorite, because it's certainly not the most interesting one stylistically. I mean, it was done by a brand new tattoo apprentice, and it's very simple. Technically, there's not really a lot of interesting stuff going on, but I just really enjoyed the books and the skull and the candle imagery. There's just something kind of fun about all that, and I like the placement of it on my forearm there. So I guess I would probably pick that. As far as regrets, yeah, that's a bit of a tough one. Yeah, tattoos are kind of funny in that you think you're getting a piece on your body that's going to be meaningful for you for the rest of your life, because it is the single most important thing in your life that is represented in that tattoo, and you think that'll never change. For example, I got some sort of Christian imagery from when I was into the whole religion thing, and that was the most important thing in my life, and I thought that would never change. And I got one to represent, and I thought that would be the most important thing in my life for my entire life, and I never would have thought that would be any different. So tattoos are more a representation of your life, about what things were important to you at different stages of your life. And you sort of have to give up the notion that the things they represent are going to remain meaningful to you for your entire life. But beyond that, I have some outright badly done tattoos. The first few I got were just really kind of basic and poorly done. And in fact, just yesterday I sent out an email inquiry to a laser removal place asking about getting some removed. I would like to remove the thorns that wrap around this arm, as well as the tattoo representing on the inside of the arm, and that'll clear up basically my entire arm to do a full proper sleeve. Because the other thing is, you start to get tattoos just here and there when you're starting to get into it, not necessarily thinking about the long term, about if you're going to be getting really heavily into the tattoos, how that's going to interfere with your ability to make big, fun, interesting pieces. Because yeah, you might get a tattoo here and there on an arm, and then now you can't get a full sleeve quite as uniformly interesting as you normally would if you hadn't got those tattoos to begin with. So I would love to go right back to the beginning, have my entire body available to do just some really big fun pieces, like something for the entire chest, the entire arms, the entire back, and remove all the little ones that I have piecemeal all around just to make room for all of that. So yeah, I guess the ones that I'm gonna get laser removes definitely have to be my regrets. I'm so dumb. Of course I have one huge, massive, glaring tattoo regret, but I don't necessarily notice it every day because it's on my back. So going back quite a while, I was at the 15-year mark of working as a paramedic, and I could already feel that the job was really breaking me down. And I thought, you know what? Maybe what I'll do is I'll get a tattoo to commemorate the job, maybe inspire me, kind of get me motivated and back into it a little bit more. And I thought, well, I want a whole back piece, so why don't I just make an entire back piece that is paramedic themed? I went to an artist who had already done a few of my other tattoos, and I knew that he was a very meticulous, slow artist, that he put a lot of time into the tattoos he did. But when I got started with his back piece, it really shocked me how long it was taking him. I basically went in for 3 8-hour sessions at a rate of $100 an hour, and after the third session he still had not got much work done at all. So by that point he was 24 hours into the back piece, and I was looking at it going, there's so much work left to be done. How on earth am I gonna afford this? This is gonna bankrupt me if I go through and finish it. And then right at that time, I lost my ability to work. So that just put the nail in the coffin, because I definitely couldn't afford to keep paying for the tattoo at that point. So ever since then, I've had this partially done back piece that I really regret, that I wish I could get rid of. I don't even like the whole theme and structure of the tattoo anymore. I wish I could just go a completely different direction with it. But should I just show you the piece? I was going to talk about all of this in a future video in my tattoo series, but I never seem to find the time to get back to that particular series. So, okay, I'll just show you the back piece and you can see what I'm talking about here. I don't know how well you could see that, but hopefully you could see what I was talking about there. I've also heard back from the laser tattoo removal people since recording the initial part of this video, and they were saying that to get rid of these solid black pieces would take about 8 to 10 sessions, spread out with about 6 to 10 weeks of healing time between each session. So going up to 10 sessions would essentially mean 10 times 10 is about 100 weeks, or essentially 2 years, and a cost of $350 per session over 10 sessions would be $3,500. That really took the wind out of my sails. I was like, there's no way. I can't put that kind of money into it. I don't know if I can even get rid of my tattoo here, which I might have to live with too, as another reminder of a stage of my life that has now passed. And then of course I want to get rid of that entire back piece. I don't know what to do about that one, to be honest. I might end up doing what's called a blast over, which is essentially don't fade the tattoo at all, just basically go straight over top of it with another piece and live with the imperfections that are coming through from the original one. Obviously that works better if you're doing really solid dark stuff over top, but that's definitely a regret, I'll tell you that. Elias's final question is, have you ever thought about going back to your old job, or would that be impossible given the situation? So the situation is that on paper, I'm still an advanced care paramedic with Toronto, but the reality is I've been on disability for years, and that is probably a permanent situation for me. I've thought constantly for all these years I've been on disability about getting back to work, how I could possibly get back to my job and become a supporter of my family again, get off of this disability which drives me crazy. But over a very long period of time, I've slowly come to a point of acceptance that my new normal is a normal where I'm just not as functional as I would like to be, both physically and mentally. And then the problem is, my education is so specialized, paramedicine doesn't necessarily translate into other careers. So the very specific education and skill sets I have that relates to working on ambulances don't necessarily translate to other things, even if I was healthy enough to be able to get back to work. So that's kind of the hole I've ended up trapped in here. And it's one reason I'm pursuing YouTube, because I have a dream of someday being financially independent, of getting off of this disability and being able to support myself through my own creative efforts. So I want to keep working at the videos. I'd love to get a book written. I've dreamed of starting a podcast, all things that, I don't know, maybe combined together will someday start bringing in a bit of money. I don't know if they'll ever be enough to support me, but going back to working as a paramedic is just unfortunately something that's not going to happen, and it's taken me years to get to that point of acceptance with that situation and with the limitations that I have, because I've never been somebody who has accepted limitations. I've lived my entire life since I was a little kid with Crohn's disease, with all the pain and the malnutrition and everything else that goes along with that. But I've always pushed through it. I've always been able to put my head down and power through, to get a job as a paramedic, to work crazy hours in Toronto, one of the busiest paramedic services in North America, to pursue hobbies and sports and all of that other stuff. And when I got to the point where I could no longer just power through, when my illnesses started to win that battle, that was hard to accept. It was hard to accept that my weaknesses, I guess, is what it comes down to. I've always been that sort of lone wolf type of personality who could just go out and do it on my own and overcome whatever was put in my way. But that's no longer the case. I'm human. I have weaknesses, more than I would like to admit. And so that's the situation I'm in now. Okay, next I'm going to dive into a bunch of questions from Richard Phillips. He starts out by asking, with all your Citadel paints, did you ever try any Warhammer? If so, what was your experience? If not, what made you avoid it? So we're talking now about the whole sort of subgenre of miniatures gaming, of getting all sorts of figures, assembling them, painting up an army, getting them onto the table with your rulers and your dice and all of that stuff. And that's something I never got into specifically. Now, having said that though, my next personal gaming foray is going to involve just dipping my toes into that world a bit, because I've bought a whole bunch of Warhammer Underworld's Night Vault stuff that's on my shelf waiting to be assembled and painted, and I have a friend that's curious to try it. Now, it differs slightly from regular miniatures gaming in that it is on a hex-based board, so it's not measured using rulers with big 3D terrain and stuff like that. It's all hex-based movement, much more like a board game, and the action on the board is powered by cards. So there's a similar deck building mechanism to Magic the Gathering, where each of the little factions, that's an army of somewhere from 3 to 7 figures maybe, has a deck of cards from which you pull cards to create your deck for the game that's going to power what happens in your game, as well as the goals and victory points you're working towards. So that's something that I'm really looking forward to getting into. The whole pandemic thing has given me lots of time to start getting those things painted up, because I'm not sure when I'll be able to get together with my friend to actually try out the game. But it will at least be the first time I have assembled minis prior to painting them. They come in a lot of different pieces, so we'll see how that works out for me. And that's going to be sort of my introduction to the whole Warhammer thing. I don't see that it's going to draw me into the miniatures hobby per se. I mean, there's so much, first of all, financial investment with buying armies of figures. There's an incredible amount of time investment with getting them all painted up. And I'm such a slow painter and have such a backlog of board game pieces to paint up already. I just don't see myself getting into that aspect of things. But Night Vault looks fun. So, Richard next asks, what's your favorite Rancid song? Favorite album? Well, first of all, Richard, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about Rancid. What's interesting is my favorite Rancid album does not contain my favorite Rancid songs. Instead, it represents a really solid group of songs where every single song on the album is top-notch, but not my very favorite. And that album is And Out Come the Wolves. There's just something about that album. Every single song is so singable and so awesome. And there's not a weak song on the album, so that is the one I tend to list as my favorite. However, my favorite Rancid songs are on their B-Sides and C-Sides album, as well as their Life Won't Wait album. So from B-Sides and C-Sides, a couple of songs I really like are Sick Sick World and I Wanna Riot. But I think my two favorite Rancid songs are both on Life Won't Wait, and those are Black Lung and 1998. They're kind of slightly different, pretty catchy songs in their own raw punk rock type of way, I guess. He follows up by asking, Operation Ivy or Lars Fredriksson and the Bastards or the Transplants? And with these, he's referring to side projects from various Rancid band members. Now, he did leave out a couple of Rancid side projects, such as Tim Armstrong's album A Poet's Life, and Matt Freeman has done Devil's Brigade, I think it's Devil's Brigade, and possibly at least one other band. And I think what Richard is asking here is, what is my favorite of the Rancid side projects? So I'm going to go ahead and insert Tim Armstrong's A Poet's Life into here, and I'm going to rank that alongside Operation Ivy, Lars Fredriksson and the Bastards, and the Transplants. So the lowest on that list is going to be the Transplants. I have all 3 of the CDs that Transplants have released. I think they have 3 albums out now, unless I've missed anything recent. And it seems that each Transplants album has 2 songs that really rock my world, and the rest I just really am not into at all. So there's quite a dichotomy there, with really liking songs and just not really liking the other ones. Above that on the ranking, I would put Tim Armstrong's A Poet's Life. It's a really chill, slightly reggae-inspired album, and it's the sort of thing that you can sit on a summer patio with a beer in the sunshine listening to. Above that, then I would put Lars Fredriksson and the Bastards. They have kind of a straightforward oi punk type of sound to them, and it's more gritty and hard, and I really quite like it. And then at the top of the list there, I put the incomparable Operation Ivy. There's something about that ska, punk, reggae, hardcore blend that was, for its time, just so mind-blowing, and even to this day really gets me fired up. So Operation Ivy is number 1 for the side projects. Richard's next question is, if you were to make a board game, what kind of game would you make? What kinds of games do you feel are missing in the board game sphere? I immediately know the answer to the first question, what kind of board game I would make. And even though I did design a board game that is basically a train route connection board game of making train routes and earning income in the process by connecting to cities across Europe, it doesn't stand out necessarily from a lot of the board games that are out there. The one dream I've had for years is, so there are a couple of popular cooperative board games. One is called Flashpoint Fire Rescue, that is about firefighting. Another is Police Precinct, about policing. And the one that's missing there for me is a game about being a paramedic. So I've long dreamed of designing a cooperative pandemic. I've long dreamed about designing a cooperative paramedic board game that can slide in with that emergency services cooperative theme of the other 2 games. I've dabbled a bit with that design. I haven't really come up with the key mechanism that ties it all together yet. Someday, I'm going to have that done and have that out there somehow. So he next asks, what kinds of games do you feel are missing in the board game spheres, which is a much deeper and more interesting question. And I can't come up with a great answer to that, really. The board game sphere is just so broad and deep. There's just so much out there at this point in time that it doesn't feel like there's a lot that's missing, other than going back to my point about the paramedic board game. So I'll probably have to leave it at that. Finally, Richard gets personal, which I love, and he asks, what are some things you do to stay healthy physically, mentally, and spiritually? Well, physically, exercise has always been vital for my own, not just my physical health, but my mental health too. And it's interesting how the pandemic has changed that. Previously, I would devote pretty much all my time to going to the gym to do weights, and that would be my exercise focus. Once in a long while, I would do a bit of cardio, something, maybe go out for a bit of a run or hit the boxing bag for a while. But I really neglected my cardio workouts pre-pandemic. With the pandemic closing down my gym, I've gotten quite the opposite. Now I've been really focusing hard on the cardio, running, biking, boxing, and I've only been doing just a little bit of resistance training for the strength training, which has been great. I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to do when the gym opens up again. I don't want to lose the cardio gains I've managed to achieve, so I'm going to have to figure out how to find a good balance between the strength training and the cardio training. And of course, all of this is just dependent on my health. There are days when the pain, the diarrhea, the fatigue kind of overwhelmed me. Moving on to mentally, that's been tough. So I guess what I'm doing for the mental side of things, I ended up getting hooked up with an organization that does fairly extensive work on the mental health side of things. It was a whole team of people where I was initially in contact with an intake person, then I got set up with a counselor and a peer support worker and a nurse, and every other week I talked to the counselor, every other week in between I talked to the peer support worker. I'm trying to do what I can for my mental health. And then finally he asked about spiritually, and the whole spiritual realm, if it exists, I think is so far outside of our human brain's understanding. I mean, we don't even understand consciousness, so to then take another leap beyond consciousness and talk about spiritual things, I think surpasses what our brains are capable of. But I appreciate Richard asking those personal questions. Alright, next, Brother John Wampler asks me, do you think the pandemic will have a positive effect on family life and board games will rise in popularity? Do you think that families will opt to stay home rather than go out looking for entertainment? And John says he hopes that that is the case. And when I started thinking about this question, what I realized was, I have no idea what other people do. I mean, I'm so isolated with no contact with anybody that I just don't know what other people are up to. I mean, like John, I would hope that forced isolation is bringing families together over board games and that they're discovering these new non-screen ways to interact with each other. But I think I'm less optimistic when it comes to humanity than John is, and I'm not quite sure that people are going to be having all of these positive effects. I haven't really seen any stats to know whether or not board game sales have increased, whether more people have been playing games. And then regarding the question about if people are going to continue to stay home rather than going out looking for entertainment once this is all over. And it won't be over until there's a vaccine out there, so that could be a year away, or who knows how long it could be. But presumably there will be an end to this. And yes, I do think it'll permanently change society and the way we interact with each other and how carefree or not we are about gathering together in large groups. But will families continue to stay home? I feel like that as soon as they're allowed to get out, they're gonna scatter and get out there. I mean, look at the beach today, it's crowded. And you see it on the news, all these people in parks and public spaces, as soon as they're allowed, they're like, pandemic be damned, I guess, they're gonna get together anyways. But maybe some of those things they learn in terms of being together as a family will stick. I hope so. James A. has a gaming question. He asks, how do you feel about board games that utilize apps like First Martians or Mansions of Madness? And this is an issue that for a minority of loud complainers is a problem. And I understand why, because there are two reasons for it. One is that board games are meant to be a non-digital experience, to take us out of the screens and the whole digital world and get us together in an analog format, to have that wonderful tactility of the physical game pieces, of being face-to-face together around a table. That's what board gaming is all about. But then the other complaint that arises is, yes, games that require an app in order to be able to play them, eventually that technology is going to be outdated and the app will no longer be playable, presumably, and so the theory is that at some point those games will be obsolete. So yeah, I can understand those reasonings. I just don't see them as being as bad as other people would see them, I think. For one thing, it is in just a minuscule, the tiniest portion of the overall board game world in terms of the number of games that use apps in order to enhance the experience. And the ones that do use them really do use them to good effect, I think. They make the gameplay easier, they add some interesting elements to the games. And in my mind, they don't really detract from the experience. Although the only real experience I've had with this sort of thing is playing XCOM, the board game. And I didn't particularly enjoy that game all that much. I didn't think it was that great a game. But it's not because of the app per se. I have no problem with the 1 in a million games that wants to use an app to enhance it. As far as the technology becoming obsolete, I don't think that's an issue at all. I mean, look at all the old video games and stuff that you can still manage to play through modern technology. There seems to always be a way to access the old technology with the modern technology. And in that case, I tend to picture in my mind a board gamer sitting there with 500 games on their game shelf with like 20 unplayed games, the rest of them maybe played once or twice, complaining about the fact that they won't be able to play their game in 10 years because of the technology will be out obsolete. And I wonder how many plays the average person that complains about it gets out of the games they already own. And by not having a problem with this issue, I know I'm going to make some people angry. They'll be angry that I'm not angry about it, I guess. But for the most part, yeah, I do enjoy the very tactile, analog nature of board gaming. And I wouldn't want it to become a ubiquitous thing, and it's really not going to be. It's not going to be an issue. But thanks for the question, James. I appreciate it. And then the final questions come from Kimbra Patty. She first asks, do you read comic books, and have you done a favorite list of them yet? And Kim, I've never really been into comic books other than when I was a kid. I was really into the Asterix books and the Tintin books. And now that I'm an adult and have reread some of them, I'm not into those things anymore. But I've never been into the superheroes thing. I remember when I was a young kid taking piano lessons, I would go to my piano teacher's house, and when I was waiting for my turn for my lesson, she would have 2 stacks of comic books next to the chair there. She would have a stack of superhero comic books and a stack of Archies, and for some reason I would always pick up the Archie comics to flip through instead of the superhero ones. It was just something I was never really into. I did a video that I'll have to link about a 2-part graphic novel thing, but no, comic books just were never my thing. And that's despite the fact that I've always been an avid reader ever since I was very young. Books have been just a big thing for me, and so maybe I've focused more on the books than comics. And finally, last question, Kim says, what was the game that got you into the board game hobby, and what inspired you to start a YouTube channel? So my history with board gaming goes all the way back to when I was a really young kid. We were a family that had lots of games in the house. We always had the most up-to-date modern board games. When I was really young, I played games like Fantasy Forest and Mastermind and Scotland Yard, and eventually worked my way up to more complex games, Escape from Colditz, and what turned out to be my favorite game eventually was a game called Shogun, which at various points has also been called Samurai Swords and Yakuza. But eventually, of course, I set out on my own and kind of got away from games for a while when I was in my early 20s. And then back in about 2003-ish, I was in a mall and I saw a half-price copy of Axis and Allies, and that brought to mind all the great memories I had with Shogun because it's in a very similar style. And so I thought, I wonder what other games are out there that are like that, these big sort of conquer the world type games. So I went to a game store and the owner was showing me some stuff, and I ended up purchasing a game called Attack that came with an expansion called just the Attack expansion maybe. But I loved that game. That was my #1 game for ages. And then it opened up my whole world to German games or Euro games. And of course, since 2003, the number of games that have come and gone in my collection are vast and interesting. So I would attribute my modern interest in games to a combination of Shogun and Attack. But what's funny about that is I dislike that style of games now, the so-called 4X style of games. Explore, expand, exploit, exterminate. I've really gone away from these really attacky type of games where you got to beat up on other players. And I've become much more of what Richard Ham terms a Care Bear type of player. Really the only game of that type that I still own and enjoy is Nexus Ops, because it's super fast playing as opposed to these other multi-hour big vast games of conquest that I used to adore so much. As far as what got me into starting a YouTube channel, as I touched on previously, I was just really desperate to find a way that might someday make me more financially independent and get me off of disability. And it allowed me to use my creativity. There's just nothing more fulfilling for me than to be creative and to be able to make and create. And I was really inspired by a couple of British YouTubers. I was inspired by a guy named Rab Florence and a little channel he had called Downtime Town, I think it was. He was a Scottish guy, and then there was the English folks who did Shut Up and Sit Down and who still do it. And they were making videos that were much more interesting to me than the standard guy standing in front of a game shelf, first going over the rules of the game and then following it up with a critique of the game. Both in the way they approached the games themselves as well as the visual approach to the medium was kind of outside the box and interesting, and I thought I wanted to do something along those lines, but I absolutely failed when I set out to do that with the very first video I tried to make. Because with my very first videography experience, I tried getting all these fancy angles and cuts and different stuff, and quickly realized I was way out of my depth. However, to this day, I still state that I don't do reviews. I don't necessarily know that criticism is the right approach to art in general. Rather, I simply talk about whatever I'm inspired to talk about. Whatever the game itself sparks in me to talk about is what I go ahead and talk about. And that's the same with books and music and the other kind of entertainment type things I discuss on my channel here. It's just, what do I think is interesting that I feel like chatting about? So thank you to Kim, James, John, Richard, and Elias. I really appreciate your questions. I'm so happy that you made it possible for me to make this video. And I'm always happy to answer whatever questions you might have, so definitely comment below if you have any further questions or any follow-ups to these answers. I love hearing from you and I love chatting with you. Holy cow, you made it to the end of this video! That really does mean a lot to me. The other thing that means a lot to me is if you would give it a thumb up or subscribe to my channel, or maybe share this video with one person that you think would enjoy it. Cheers! What do you call it? And you sort of have to give up the notion that they are going to, and you sort of have to give up the notion that the things they represent are going to remain meaningful. I'm so dumb! I'm so dumb! I wish I could just go a completely direction. It's more gritty and hard, and I quite maybe someday I'll know, and maybe someday I'll know, and maybe someday I'll never know. Maybe someday I'll know. And as Rahdo said, and I've become much more what Rahdo terms